Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to talk about a great unraveling. How did a world that felt like it was built to last forever, the Victorian era, just completely fall apart, making way for the really turbulent 20th century?
And H.G. Wells just nailed this feeling of dislocation when he said the world ceased to be a home and became the mere site of a home. It's that feeling of being like a camper on a messy construction site instead of being warm and comfortable inside a finished house. And that feeling, that sense of being totally unmoored, that's really the heart of what we're digging into today.
Okay, so to really get this whole unraveling thing, first we've got to understand what was being unraveled, right? The Victorians, they saw their world as this grand house, built on these incredible, unshakable foundations that they thought were set for all time. So this world, it was held up by these four gigantic pillars: the family, the Constitution, the sprawling British Empire, and the Christian religion. And these weren't just institutions. They were seen as final, perfect, permanent. I mean, you just did not question them, period.
So, what was the biggest difference? Well, it really all came down to attitude. The Victorian spirit was all about acceptance, about affirming authority. But the 20th century spirit, totally different. It was defined by this restless, energetic need to question, to reject, and this almost electrifying new idea that everything could and probably would change.
But, of course, a world this solid-seeming, well, it couldn't last forever. There were these three major forces that started to chip away at those unshakable foundations.
So, where did it all start? Well, a big piece of it was scientific progress. And you might be surprised, it was the internal combustion engine. All of a sudden, cars and motorcycles gave millions of people, especially young people, a kind of mobility they'd never had before. And what did that do? It basically fueled this revolt of youth, because for the first time, young people could literally just drive away from their parents' control. And right at the same time, you had these radical new philosophies popping up that started to attack the very idea of unquestioned authority. And just like that, everything changed. Every single dogma, every tradition, every assumption people had was now being held up to the light for a really tough inspection. I mean, suddenly nothing was sacred anymore. And you know who was basically the trumpet call for this whole new way of thinking? The playwright, George Bernard Shaw. This line from his character, Andrew Undershaft, is the perfect challenge. He's basically saying, hey, why are we so fast to throw out our old technology, but so terrified to update our old ideas? Shaw was pushing people to question, to examine, and to personally test every single belief they held.
Now, for some people, this is just incredibly exciting, right? But for others, like Shaw's own character, Barbara, this loss of certainty was absolutely terrifying. Just imagine it. You're standing on this rock you've been told is eternal, and all of a sudden you feel it start to reel and crumble right under you. That's the kind of disorientation a lot of people were feeling. So if all that was just the first cracks appearing, well, the sledgehammer that came in and completely shattered the old world, that was war. The two world wars, they didn't just chip away at the foundations, they blew them to pieces. The sheer scale of it all, the industrialized horror of modern warfare, it just completely obliterated any of those old romantic ideas about glory and honor. Sure, scientific progress had given humanity the car, but it also gave us the airplane, the tank, these tools for mass slaughter on a scale nobody could have imagined. And you can really see the shift in the whole mood of the country. It was just stark. In 1914, Britain marches off to war with this romantic, patriotic enthusiasm. Fast forward to 1939, and all of that is gone. Instead, you've got this grim, plodding, stoical determination. Even the poetry changed. The First War's poetry was often uplifting. The Second's was quiet in a minor key, and a lot of times pretty obscure. Yeah, pretty much all that innocence was just gone. So after that First War, the culture itself just fractured, especially literature. It's like the great writers of the day just walked off the main highway of communication and locked themselves up in this private intellectual fortress. And if you want to pinpoint a moment, look no further than 1922. It was a huge year. Two absolute landmarks of modernism came out: James Joyce's Ulysses and T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And both of them were dense, they were difficult, they were packed with obscure references. Brilliant, sure, but this was a deliberate move away from writing for the common reader. And this created a huge split. T.S. Eliot himself actually called it an antinomy, a conflict.
On one side, you had this new, super complex literature for a tiny elite audience. And on the other, you had life as it was lived by the average intelligent reader, who was pretty much being told, this isn't for you anymore.
And honestly, the contempt for the public could be pretty shocking. One of James Joyce's interpreters actually boasted that Joyce never stooped to the level of the hydra-headed rabble of the mental underworld. I mean, can you believe that? That's how they were talking about the general public. This wasn't just a style choice. It was like an intellectual war.
Okay, so what were people actually reading then? Well, while all the elite critics were looking down their noses at authors like John Galsworthy, calling him old-fashioned, his novel, The Forsyte Saga, was a total runaway bestseller. We're talking heading towards its 50th printing. It's just crystal clear proof of the giant canyon that had opened up between what the critics cared about and what the public actually wanted to read.
And this whole cultural shift, it just hit the accelerator after the Second World War. Britain becomes this affluent welfare state, based on the idea that if you get rid of economic hardship, people will be happy. But it didn't work. In fact, all this new prosperity just sort of peeled back a layer to reveal a much deeper, way more troubling problem.
You see, with those old pillars of religion and morality completely torn down, there was, well, nothing to put in their place. The revolt against the Victorians had left behind a giant spiritual vacuum. And what rushes into a vacuum? In this case, it was this new kind of sullen discontent, a whole lot of anxiety, and just plain moral confusion.
And guess who rushed in to fill that spiritual vacuum? Advertisers, of course. They came up with this powerful new way of persuading people that had nothing to do with how good a product was. They started using this new thing called depth psychology to basically bypass your rational brain and forge these automatic emotional links in your subconscious, connecting our deepest human desires for love or status to totally mundane products like beer or refrigerators or a tube of lipstick. So all of this leaves us with a really big question. In tearing down that whole Victorian house of certainty, did we actually build something better in its place? Or did we just end up like H.G. Wells said at the very beginning, like campers lost on a construction site, trapped in a brand new kind of cage, one built out of anxiety and what we're supposed to buy next? It's something worth thinking about.